Okay, thank you. Hi, welcome back to Videos from the Ville. I'm Charlie Greenewalt, and this is State and Local Government, and we are going to pick up where we left off last time on totalitarianism. We were interrupted, and I wasn't able to finish the presentation on totalitarianism. Let's do that and move on then to discuss democracy and to discuss terms that all students should be somewhat familiar with. We'll talk about them, and then we'll move on, and we'll talk about theories of elites, and we'll talk about Marxism. Okay? Well, we said that the last two world political systems were totalitarianism and democracy. And we started out with totalitarianism, saying that it can be defined as the complete subservience of the individual to the state. The complete subservience of the individual to the state. We find out that two of the best books that have been written about totalitarianism are by Hannah Arendt, A-R-E-N-D-T, Hannah Arendt, that's just called Totalitarianism, or on Totalitarianism. And then the other book was written by Zbigniew Brzezinski. He was the National Security Affairs Advisor under Jimmy Carter. He is the father to Mia Brzezinski, that some of you may recognize from MSNBC and formerly from CBS. But Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a fabulous book about totalitarianism, and he got all kinds of awards for it, and it's still looked to as one of the best explanations of what totalitarianism is. Now, by the way, you spell his last name Brzezinski. Brzezinski, Brzezinski. Well, for there to be a totalitarian state, according to Brzezinski, one must have six characteristics, and I'd like you to memorize them. This will hold you in good stead for the rest of your life. One, there would have to be an official ideology. This is a doctrine that a state has, or a group of individuals have, that tries to explain all the vital aspects of man's existence. An ideology. We find that in the 20th century, two of the best examples of totalitarians, of course, were Hitler in Germany during the Second World War, and Stalin in the Soviet Union. These were two of the best examples of totalitarianism. Now we'll go back and we'll explain this further. This is totalitarianism of the right and totalitarianism of the left. But we find that they all need these six characteristics. And one is an official ideology. Well, the official ideology of Nazi Germany before and during the Second World War was National Socialism. National Socialism, or what we refer to or use as a contraction, if you will, Nazism, Nazis. You find that the official ideology of the Soviet Union, of course, was Marxism-Leninism. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And that, of course, just before the Second World War and during the Second World War, of course, the ruler of the Soviet Union was Joseph Stalin. And this is totalitarianism of the left. Totalitarianism of the left. Some people call it communism, but it's really not communism, not theoretically. It's just leftist totalitarianism. Well, so the first characteristic of totalitarianism is, one, an official ideology. Secondly, there's a single mass political party led by one person, commonly referred to as the dictator. Okay. Number three, there's terroristic police control of the population. So the secret police used terror to control the population. You find that the secret police under Hitler, of course, were the Gestapo. The secret police under Stalin were the KGB. One, two, three. A fourth characteristic of totalitarianism would be that the state has a monopoly of violence. That means there is very effective gun control, and the people have no way to resist the overwhelming power of the state, the overarching power of the state. One of the first things they do is they sweep through the country and they seize all weapons, as the Nazis did after they came to power. So there's a monopoly on violence. The only ones that have firearms are the state itself. So a monopoly of violence. Number 5 would be a monopoly on mass communications. The state controls all mass communications. So the state controls television, radio, newspapers. They control the internet. They control your phone system and your telegraph system. They control the shortwave radio systems of the country. There's nothing that they don't control. And to show you how important Stalin and the Soviets thought the control of communications was, we find that most people in the aftermath of the Second World War, most people around the world, in underdeveloped portions of the world, would rely on shortwave radio as a means of communications. So after the Second World War, the United States built Radio Free Europe to broadcast just to Eastern Europe, Radio Liberty to broadcast just to the Soviet Union, Voice of America to broadcast to the whole world. Well, the Soviet Union was so threatened by the broadcasts of Radio Liberty that they started to jam Radio Liberty. But they didn't have to just jam Radio Liberty. They had to jam the Voice of America. They had to jam the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC. They had to jam the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC. They had to jam Radio France, Radio Netherlands, and so forth. They had to jam Deutsche Welle, the West German shortwave radio system. And quite frankly, they spent more money to jam all these Western shortwave services than the total budget of all those systems put together. So if you added the total budget of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America, the CBC, the BBC, Radio France, Radio Netherlands, and so on, you add up the total budget, and you'd find that the Soviets spent more than that just to jam Western broadcasts, because they didn't want their people being exposed to information that came from the West, information that they didn't control. Well, lastly, you find that the sixth characteristic of totalitarianism, according to Zbigniew Brzezinski, is the central control and direction of the entire economy. Central control and direction of the entire economy. That simply means that the central government would decide what natural resources are going to be used, what's going to be produced, where it's going to be sold, for what price it's going to be sold. They would control all that, and that's one of the reasons, of course, why no socialist country has ever succeeded. We find that you need the marketplace and market forces to be able to direct those decisions. We find that in the Soviet Union you had a small handful of octogenarians led by Stalin who made these decisions unilaterally, and of course they ended up making things that nobody wanted, or sold at a ridiculous price that no one could afford, or it was too low. You find that you need the market to guide those particular decisions. Now, we said that there's leftist and rightist totalitarianism. Let me explain that to you. Leftist totalitarianism is what we traditionally call communism. Um, what you find that leftist totalitarianism is just that, because it doesn't um, fulfill. It's not communism. Communism is a very specific system arrived at in a very specific way, and what we regard as communist systems don't have those attributes, and they don't go about acquiring them in the way that they should in the theoretical world. As many people just go ahead and use that as a shorthand. And rightist totalitarianism is what we commonly refer to as fascism. So this is what we have, this difference between rightist and leftist totalitarianism. Okay. Well, the last system that we haven't talked about yet is democracy. Democracy is when the sovereign power of a country resides in the people as a whole. The sovereign power of the country resides in the people as a whole. There's two forms of democracy. There's direct democracy and indirect democracy. In direct democracy, people decide their laws for themselves. They make an actual vote on what laws they're going to accept and which laws they're going to reject. So that's direct democracy. Indirect democracy is representative democracy, where we elect people. We elect representatives to go to our capital and make those decisions for us. So direct democracy and indirect democracy. Now, the best examples that we have of direct democracy would be what? Well, we have ancient Athens. The city-state in Greece was a direct democracy. We find that another current-day example of direct democracy could be found in New England in the town meeting system, where all the people meet several times per year to consider legislation put forth by their fellow citizens, and then to vote whether to accept it or reject it as a law. Now, indirect democracy is a situation where people elect representatives. They elect people to go ahead and make the laws for them. And they don't vote per se on the people don't vote on the legislation themselves as they do in direct democracy. They decide who is going to be the people that will make those decisions, or indirect democracy. What are some examples of indirect democracy? Well, how about here the United States right now? You have Great Britain, you have Canada, France, all examples of indirect democracy. Okay, well, when we have indirect democracy, what do we have? We're electing an individual to go to the Capitol and vote on legislation for us. So this person could be considered to be a representative. And every representative that we elect in an indirect democracy has a decision to make, and that is, will they represent themselves, or will they contend that they want to represent the public interest? So do they want to be a delegate, or do they want to be a trustee? If they want to be a delegate, that means they think they're voting as the way the people want. They're giving the people exactly what they want as a delegate. As a trustee, they are voting their conscience. They are trying to figure out what you, the people, want, but they're going to vote as they see fit. So the roles for a representative are being a delegate or a trustee. Now, we find that these representatives, they constitute and what we call an elite. These representatives because what is an elite? An elite is any people of group. An elite is any group or identifiable group of people who possess a disproportionate share of some political power, in this case, a disproportionate share of some valued resource. In this case, we're talking about political power. And I guess that's the best way to explain it. An elite is an identifiable group of people who possess a disproportionate share of some valued resource. Okay? All right. Well, we find that these representatives are indeed elites. They're elites. So, how do we explain the actions of elites? Let's take a look at this. How do we explain the actions of elites? Well, there are 4 types of elite theories that we want to just touch on today. And that would be bureaucratic theory, elite theory, pluralism, or Marxism. So the theories that explain the actions of elites that we have with us at this point are federalism, the theories that we have that explain the actions of elites are bureaucratic theory, elite theory, pluralism, and Marxism. Bureaucratic theory was given to us by Max Weber. Max Weber we've talked about. He was a German historian sociology who lived and worked from the middle of the 20th century in Germany, and he then continued his work into the 1920s. He's considered to be the father of bureaucracy. So bureaucratic theory is the first elite theory. The second elite theory is called elite theory, elite. And this gets sticky as we look at the productions that have been on TV for the last 2 nights on elite programming, the theories on elites. Well, elite theory. One of the best examples of an elite theorist was C. Wright Mills. There's a picture of C. Wright Mills on your screen on a PowerPoint. Well, C. Wright Mills, he wrote a book called The Power Elite. He wrote The Power Elite in 1956. The Power Elite was written in 1956. And it essentially said what he had been saying for many years before. And he said that what we can do is find the actions, we follow the actions of these elite members. Okay, so elite theory. C. Wright Mills wrote in 1956 The Power Elite, and what was the content of elite theory? You find that C. Wright Mills ended up teaching primarily at Columbia University, and C. Wright Mills in the book, the 1956 book, The Power Elite, essentially says this. He says elite theory just shows us that governments are controlled by elites that are not part of the government. And he said that our government at that time was controlled by an elite comprised of corporate leadership, military leadership, and key political leadership. Those 3 groups of people joined together and they ran the country. Now, some of his followers said, well, C. Wright, we think you're onto something. We agree that military leaders and political leaders and corporate leaders are very important to running the country, but we think that there are 2 other groups that you missed. And 2 groups you missed would include key media representatives, so key media leaders, and another group would be labor union leaders. So if you add labor union leaders and key media leaders, then you would have a truly elite theory that everyone could agree with, perhaps. So that's three elite theories. No, two elite theories that are out there. One, bureaucratic theory. Two, elite theory. And then we come to a third elite theory, and that's the theory of pluralism. Theory of pluralism. Pluralism has no mother, it has no father, it has no birth date, it has no expiration date. Pluralism essentially says that every political area, every area of public policy has a different elite that is waiting to Okay, next we go on to pluralism. Pluralism. As we said, pluralism, it has no mother and it has no father. We find that pluralism simply says that every area of public policy has its own series of experts. Every area of public policy has a key group of people that government refers to when they want to know something about that area. And indeed, this is how our country really works. You find that, one of my most important years when I was policy director for the state senate, we wanted to put out a very comprehensive package that would cover all the areas that were necessary to reform state primary and secondary education. And we did that, and we put out another big policy area with a group of initiatives. I think those were 23 initiatives to reduce illegal drugs in society. So we did that as well. And then another area where we wanted to put together a 10-bill package on agriculture. Well, when we wanted to move ahead on substance abuse, for example, who did we see? We went to see some of the best people in the Commonwealth on substance abuse. We showed them the package, we got their ideas, we picked their brains, and we went back and we rewrote some of the legislation, and we made it better, thanks to that no holds barred meeting that we had with the counselors, the leaders of the Association of Counselors for Substance Abuse in Pennsylvania. They were very helpful. So we had better legislation. So, and then a few months later, we had to do a package on agriculture. So do you think I went back to the people that advised us on drugs? No. We went to people that were knowledgeable about agriculture, and we picked their brains. We went over to Gettysburg and we talked to the leaders of the Mason-Dixon farm and picked their brains about some of the latest developments in agriculture and agricultural productivity. Okay, so that's pluralism, and that's essentially how our country works. Anytime we need to know something, we go to the leaders in that field and we pick their brains. Okay, so that is elite theories. Finally, we come to Marxism, Marxism-Leninism. Let's take a good hard look at Marxism-Leninism, because many of you think you know all about it and you've heard something about it, but when you're tested on it, you know very little about it. So let's try to tackle this subject. Marxism-Leninism, of course, was designed by Karl Marx from Trier, Germany, sitting right on the border between Germany and France. But at any rate, you find that Marx had several core beliefs. One, he believed that if he believed hard enough, that Marxism would come to pass. He knew that he was right, and he had the mantle, if you will, of a true believer, believing that he didn't know how long his theories would take to come true, but he believed that they certainly would. Okay? So this is Marxism. Marxism believes that, number one, that all societies are divided into certain classes. And he told us in case of the United States, for example, Marxists today will tell you, oh, well, you have an aristocracy, a bourgeoisie, you have a proletariat, you have intellectuals, and then you have workers. So, or somewhere what some people would say, or some farmers. But Marx believes that all societies are broken down into classes. First class would be aristocracy, second class would be the bourgeoisie, the third class would be the proletariat or the workers, fourth class would be, that would be the next. And then you have the aristocracy, bourgeoisie, the proletariat, intellectuals, and farmers. Okay, well, what Marx said is that all societies will develop in the same way. They'll all develop in the same way. And what's true is that when a proletariat is formed, and supposedly a process of Marxism is in the works, you find that that's rarely the case. That's rarely the case. You find that the development of socialism, where it's supposed to occur, will take generations and generations. Well, what does Marx say happens in these situations where it develop into socialism? Well, number one, he said that the power goes immediately. The power just flows from the aristocracy to the bourgeoisie down to the proletariat. So you go from the aristocracy to the bourgeoisie to the proletariat. And then when we look at the dictatorship of a single proletariat. So, again, what happens is that all societies, according to Marx, consist of the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, intellectuals, and farmers. Okay? And he believes that all societies will evolve in the same way. First, you have the aristocracy. The aristocracy has the power in society. Now, this is comprised of the royalty, large landowners, friends of the monarch, and they have power. And as time goes by, the bourgeoisie captures power away from them. The bourgeoisie would include some white-collar workers, some union members, some people who are in use of these theories. So we go from the aristocracy, which is the monarchy and large landowners, to the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is comprised of all the people that are involved in commerce, people that are comprised in banking and business, the bourgeoisie. And then finally, they believe they would go to the proletariat. So he believes that first in any society, the aristocracy has the power, that they control so much of the land that they will control the country. And they think that sometime, as the Industrial Revolution proceeds, that you'd have these people in the aristocracy that would be forcing the people to work too hard and too long for too little money. So when that happens, eventually these people will rise up in a violent political revolution, and they will seize power for themselves, watching a lot of perhaps CNN News to see what's going on elsewhere in the world. But when the bourgeoisie rises up and takes the place of the aristocracy, you find that the bourgeoisie then you find that the factories will supposedly get larger and larger. The bourgeoisie will be less attentive to the needs of the worker. And just as the bourgeoisie rose up in a violent political revolution to establish what they call a democracy, we find that when we get to this stage, the Marxists say, in the evolution of Marxism, the same thing will happen for the rest of the people in society. They will rise up against the bourgeoisie and against their working conditions, and they will have a violent revolution, and then they will put the workers, the proletariat, into power. And the proletariat supposedly will spend years, decades, establishing something called the dictatorship of the proletariat. Meanwhile, the government is supposed to be waxing and waning away, slowly disappearing. We don't want to have the state anymore, so you're letting it pass away. And you have a dictatorship of the proletariat. The workers control the state until the state comes back and contacts them and says, okay, we're proceeding fine in this proletariat, and it's time to look at what we've been doing. So, well, what's going on here in the development of Marxism? What's going on is that they hope to establish a system of socialism where you're simply trying to make all people more equal in the society in regard to wages, in regard to money, in regard to wealth. And you find that when we look at Marxism, though, it's a little different than socialism in that we are trying to create the perfect socialist man and socialist woman in a true Marxist society. You're trying to create a worker, true perfect socialist man, socialist woman, trying to create a worker that will essentially be the perfect socialist man and socialist woman that will abide by the slogan, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Someone that is willing to sacrifice from themselves for the good of others, that they hope that the perfect socialist system will establish itself in the near future. So that's one of the problems with Marxism. Is simply, well, before we even do that, now we don't talk about Marxism very often. We talk about Marxism-Leninism. How did Marxism-Leninism come about? What changed? Well, we've had Marxism for a long time, but we find that in the Soviet Union, we find once Stalin got into power, we find that he, in many instances, said, I can't wait. I'm not going to wait for the pages of history to unfold on their own. And he didn't. So you find that you have an injection of violence into the political system. Find this is what Stalin is, what Stalin introduced into what Lenin introduced into Marxism. So that you have this injection of violence because what did Lenin say? Lenin said, I can't wait for the pages of history to unfold naturally. So he wants to hurry the passage of history so he can see the development of Marxism. So he does that through the injection of violence. Okay, let's see. Of course, what's true ultimately is where Marx says we'll see the perfect Marxist societies would be in the developed countries, and he pointed a finger at the United States and France. We find that where did we see the Marxist revolutions? Of course, they were in places like, for example, Russia in 1917, China in 1948, and maybe Cuba in 1940, 58, 59. They are found in some of the most backward countries rather than some of the most advanced countries. And that's not what his theory was saying. You also find that you can't have the perfect socialist man or socialist woman, and that simply flies against that dictum that we looked at, the very first thing I asked you to remember in this class, that the maxim that underlies all of economics and political science is desires are limitless or infinite, and societal resources are finite or limited. And because of that, you can't have the perfect socialist man and socialist woman because of human nature. You find that even in areas that have tried communist, if you will, Marxist cells, such as Northern Europe during the end of the 19th century, and parts of some communes in North America in the latter half of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Obviously, what happens at some point is jealousy, covetousness, and it's just human nature that one family's child got more beans than my family's child, and so I asked why that was this case, and here we go. Infinite desires and finite resources. That really eliminates the possibility of developing the perfect socialist man and socialist woman, one that will always abide by, from each according to his abilities and to each according to his needs. We find that, of course, a true Marxist society wants to develop a situation where I might manufacture cars and you might manufacture shoes. I see your cars being held together by duct tape and I just give you a new one. You see that my shoes are being held together with staples and you give me a new one. Of course, I give you some hush puppies. You really wanted Reeboks. I give the person that needs a car a Volkswagen, and they really wanted a Lamborghini. So one of the true problems with the development of the perfect socialist man and socialist woman, it just runs straight smack up against human nature. So I think that covers this introductory material. We've covered all the what is politics, what are the world political systems, covered political terms, and now we covered theories of elites. So Marxism, of course, is the final one. Marxism is just another theory to explain the actions of elites. Okay, I'm going to sign off here, and we'll be back with the next presentation in a little bit.